and thanks to everybody for joining us today here in the Accelitas webinar. Those of you in Central Time today, thanks for joining us during your lunch. We appreciate it. I'm going to be your host for today, and my name is Jimmy Williams. I'm with Accelitas, and I run the sales and client-facing team here. The topic for today's webinar is going to be lending during a crisis, a very timely topic. A lot of the content here is really from our clients, from our prospects, from our partners in the industry. Happy to share this information. Hopefully it's helpful for you and your business. And certainly before we get started, just on behalf of everybody here at Accelitas, hope that you, your families, your coworkers, your friends are all doing well during this time. We will, as was said earlier, we'll leave some time at the end for a Q&A session. What we recommend is during the process here, go ahead and plug your questions in as they come up. And the way you can do that is don't use the Q&A box. Go ahead and if you look at the three dots that are on the right-hand side of that little control panel, there's a chat function in there. You can go ahead and just pop them in there. When we get to the end, we'll pull those together. We'll go through introductions here in a second, but just wanted to reinforce that that's probably the best way to get them going. And just to throw out there as well, I know sometimes there's questions that come up after the fact, or maybe ones that you don't necessarily want to throw out there in a webinar format. By all means, if there's another question you have for us, feel free to email me at the end, or if it's one that you can provide that note on during the chat, that's cool too. So at this point, what we'll do today is really go through the introductions, talk about some of the key things that we're hearing from lenders, some of the insights we're seeing in the marketplace, talk about some of the things that we're doing and that our clients are doing to help work around this, and then again, leave time at the end for a Q&A. So at this point, let me introduce the three of us here. As I mentioned, my name is Jimmy. I run the sales and client-facing team here. I'm based out of the greater Philadelphia metropolitan area. Been with Accelitas for about a year and 2 weeks, who's counting. Prior to this, I worked at Bank of America on the emerging payments and strategy team. And for the 19 years prior to that, I worked at First Data prior to the Fiserv acquisition, leading teams in the payment space and also as an individual contributor. And we have a little fun fact about me here. Yes, I'm really hoping that breakdancing makes a comeback. As soon as we get hopping on those planes again, I got some folded up cardboard ready to go. So excited to show you that. And let me introduce my boss, Greg Cote. Greg, give a wave. Greg is based in our Petaluma headquarters area in Petaluma, California. And if you're not familiar with Petaluma, it's wine country, so feel free to come visit us. Greg leads Accelitas's business strategy and daily operations. And before coming to Accelitas and co-founding it back in 2004, Greg was a portfolio manager at J&W Seligman & Company, a New York-based investment management firm that managed $40 billion in assets. And quick fun fact about Greg, big hockey guy, and he's been hit by 8 hockey pucks over his right eye. It wasn't actually until I looked at the slide a little bit earlier that I thought about maybe, Greg, you should have ducked maybe for like the following 6 or 7 times. 8.
Hockey players are not the smartest people, Jimmy.
I'm just calling it out.
Thanks, everyone. Glad to be here.
Yep. And then last but absolutely not least is Steve Krozik. And Steve runs our research and development and data science group here at Accelitas. Steve specializes in pattern recognition, computer vision, AI, machine learning, and prior to coming here, he held research positions at the Naval Research Laboratory, Cognitech Systems, Quantcast, and SolarTech. Steve is based in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and Steve, just again, kind of got to pick on you a little bit here. Your fun fact is you optimize Raspberry Pi to smoke brisket in your barbecue. I got to tell you, I actually had to ask somebody what Raspberry Pi was. Now that I know, you have absolutely secured your place as the top geek here at Accelitas. So no one's going to be taking that crown from you. A little bit about Accelitas and who we are. Our mission is overall to reimagine financial access through the use of data and analytics. There's 3 primary parts to our business. You see at the bottom left here. There's the identity confirmation side of things, predicting credit, and reconciliation of payments. Today, the primary area of that topic is going to be around predicting credit. We're happy to talk about the others. It's just that the focus for today are those is that section. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that we take just absolutely incredible pride in our culture and our approach here at Accelitas. We really want to make sure that we understand and learn as much as we can about our clients as possible, and learn about what their challenges are so that we don't become just another vendor for them. So if you're working with us today, hopefully that's your perception. If we don't work with you today, we hope to have that opportunity. So let's get after it and talk a little bit about what lenders are saying. Again, my disclaimer here is that the feedback we're getting is going to be from public sources, clients, prospects, partners. So kind of glopped a lot of that together to be hopefully useful information for all of you. Before we do that though, I want to introduce our first quick polling question and just give about 10 or 15 seconds here for the response. Everybody's been impacted differently, but they're going to pop up with a poll here. Rate the level of impact that coronavirus has had on the way you do business today. And again, just about another 10 seconds or so. All right, let's take a look at the answers. Wow, the majority of people saying major impact. So that's not terribly surprising. I think for a lot of companies out there, that's been pretty consistent. The smallest number being minimal impact and no impact with 0. So makes sense for sure. All right, and let's talk a little bit about some of these insights just in general. So one of the things that we've done over the course of the last 90 days or so is really listen to a lot of the lenders in the marketplace to get an understanding of actually what they're seeing. And what we've done is actually broken them into these couple different categories based on those ongoing discussions. So first, in the online lending space, initially what we heard was that there was just an incredibly massive increase in the number of lead opportunities coming in. What we heard from that as well was that each of those lenders in the online space had a very, very different approach and appetite as far as what they were going to do with that increase in those leads. Some looked at them and said, "Hey, holy cow, this is crazy. We need to let the dust settle here a little bit to understand what this is." Some others looked at it and said, "Hey, there's probably something in here. My best practices will lead me to a path where I can do something with them." And then some others took a pretty interesting approach, which is that, hey, you know what? There's customers to be earned here. This is a time when people really need help, and these leads wouldn't be appearing if it weren't for that. So the response has been pretty significantly different. And even the feedback here, to be really candid, has changed over a period of weeks. And obviously, in a lot of cases, those leads have dwindled quite a bit as there's been some change towards more organic focus. On the storefront side of things, so now we're talking about physical location lending. Obviously, the shelter in place, that's what the SIP here is. The shelter in place has pretty drastically impacted people across the board. And at least initially, I think we can all say in all 50 states, there was kind of some confusion about what was essential and what wasn't going to be essential. And I think it probably really took a couple of weeks, and this is the feedback that we got, a couple of weeks for some of the associations and some of those groups to come out to help to get clarification that storefront lending was truly essential financial services, just like a conventional bank. But that initial focus of everybody needs to stay home, everybody needs a shelter in place, in some cases caused some confusion for sure. What we have heard for certain is that as shelter in place gets lifted, or, you know, again, quite frankly, that as people got used to the change, that we began to see more and more volume go to those physical locations. Interestingly, for businesses who have both an online lending and a storefront lending business, which is not terribly uncommon, there was also kind of a valve shift that some people made saying that, hey, online lending may be too risky now. I'm going to shift my focus to storefront. Still having to deal with the challenges there of, can I operate those storefront locations in a successful way? Dealer and merchant lending, if you're not familiar with this concept, you know, probably the easiest example here is that a manufacturer is selling products through a retailer and offers financing. Transmissions are kind of a great example of that, where transmission is very, very expensive. You're going to a shop and you need to buy a transmission, you could finance that over time. And it could be just point of sale lending as well. These really fell into two very distinct categories. If the product was deemed as essential, many of these folks have said that their volumes are strongly, strongly up, and they're doing very, very well. The fact that people are in need of an opportunity to have time to spend or time to pay back, it's been a really helpful thing. The flip side of that coin, though, is that if the product, if the retailer, if the merchant didn't have an online presence they could operate with, and they were deemed non-essential and were impacted by the shelter in place, their volumes in a lot of cases just completely dwindled or crashed. Again, this was kind of initial feedback that came out. Some of this has changed over time, and each state is very different. Here in Pennsylvania, there's changes to this, kind of on a weekly basis, and I'm sure where you're at, you may be experiencing the same darn thing. The next category of automotive lending is kind of an interesting one, because if there's an example of necessity breeding some innovation, this is probably a great one. So obviously, most car purchases, or many of the car purchases that happen today, still happen in person, with somebody going to a dealer, completing that whole sales cycle in the dealership. The shelter in place in many states has significantly impacted the ability to get this done. And what's happened, and I don't know if there's anybody on the call today who has purchased a car in the last 90 days or so, but I can tell you that there's two very distinct differences here. We have an employee who bought a car just in the last couple of weeks here at Accelitas, and he described the least friction-filled environment possible. The entire interaction was very electronic, didn't even have to talk to a human being. The person came to his house with the car, no contact situation, and after that was done, they went and took his car that he was trading in. He described a process that I think for those of us who bought cars like me back in February, where it was a very distinctly different approach of sitting in a dealership for a bunch of hours, filling out a bunch of forms, feeling very much like it did 7 or 8 years ago still. I think what we're going to continue to see is that this may be the tip of the spear for some continued innovation. So this is kind of an interesting one. And again, as the shelter in place changes, I think this will be one that that needle moves pretty quickly. And the last one on here is fairly obvious, which is the credit card portfolios. So thinking about the pre-approved offers that show up in mailboxes, obviously in a lot of cases, what those parties have done is to reduce the number of pre-approved offers they're sending. Just because there's just a lot of noise out there. Obviously the news cycles are doing what they're doing. People are impacted. There's been a reduction, not a stoppage, but certainly a reduction along those lines. So again, just to really clarify, this is the feedback that we've heard from many, many different folks out there. And what was really interesting is just how consistent so much of it was. That said, we would love to hear from all of you. If you're seeing something different or have seen something different, we would love to get that kind of feedback loop going so that we can get an understanding of that, because obviously there's a lot that we could potentially do together to help in some of these cases. This is actually a CFPB graphic here. We've cited the source, and so this is March data. So this is percentage change in credit inquiries relative to the first week of March 2020. And the categories, you can see them, kind of a little bit hard to see, but automotive on the far left, brand new mortgages, revolving credit card, unspecified and other. Unspecified and other is kind of a catch-all for a lot of the lending category. So look, I think we all know that that overall volume would be expected to be down on these, but the reasons behind it are a heck of a lot more complex than I think any could really think of. And one of them that's on here is a really, really big one, which is there's this just general fear, an emotional fear of being rejected. That, hey, things have changed. Maybe my credit scores changed. Maybe my ability to get credit is impacted. So in some cases, people are just simply not asking. So that's one part of it. Another part is that since this is March, you kind of like take a time machine trip for a second here. In March, we were talking about the stimulus, but there were still a lot of questions around it. So there was certainly some consumer basis of not being sure what money they were going to get, but thinking that they were going to get money. So in some cases, there's some reduced demand simply because, hey, I'm going to have a fairly big check that's going to be in the mail or direct deposit at some point soon. But then there's some other sort of noisy reasons, which we have listed here, that really are a little bit all over the place in the fact that, who they might have been lending from, especially if it's a conventional bank, may not have been necessarily ready to operate with them in that environment. Or there may be a scenario where that may be their pathway may have normally been to go to a physical location, and they were impacted by the shelter in place. So again, sort of just not as simple as simply just, hey, coronavirus happened, volume is down, people are impacted. Everybody's got a little bit of a different story behind it. And I think that as we go through this and as we listen to more and more people's personal stories, we'll be better armed in trying to not only understand, but think about the next products for them. So this is also a CFPB graphic. And so this is specifically auto loans. I believe this is just for in-person auto loans. But what you're seeing here is change, again, over the course of March, looking at the change in demand for auto loan inquiries. So take a step back and think about the states where coronavirus was most significantly impacted initially, again, back in March, and think about where the shelter-in-place orders were first and pretty significant. So immediately you see California, you see some of the Northeast states, you see Michigan, you see kind of the beginnings of post-Mardi Gras, New Orleans and Louisiana. So this makes sense. So it's inconsistent by state, kind of all over the place, but certainly we can at least see some degree of logic to it on where it's trending. And I'm going to turn it over to Steve here for a second, who is going to talk a little bit about some areas where we're actually seeing some increase in demand.
Steve? Yeah, thank you. So we've been monitoring changes in the population for some of our customers during the pandemic, and these resulted in some interesting observations that I'll show you here. So this plot shows one specific attribute that we measure regarding the time since the customer was last seen by a specific data vendor. So just to know that all these data vendors, or all these customers were seen by that data vendor at one point in time on this plot. And also you should know that this data contains both positive and negative indicators regarding activity. So on the plot, we have time bucketed into the year spans of 0 to 1, 2 to 4, and then more than 5. So the populations falling into these buckets are stratified by month, and the size of the populations are represented by the height of the bars. So the change here is fairly easy to observe. The number of applicants falling into the bucket representing a customer not seen in over 5 years has drastically increased from the months of January and February to March, and then even more so in April. And now in April, we see the number of customers not seen in over 5 years now outweighs the number of customers that have been recently seen within the 0 to 1 bucket. So observing that change is the first critical step. And then understanding and predicting the effect of this change is what's going to be most beneficial to our customers. So an initial and very valid concern may be an increase in fraudulent transactions during the pandemic. Although when we looked into historical data of customers that fit this profile, segmenting specifically on that attribute, we found that they were 30% more profitable than the average consumer. So the takeaway from this one simple example is that populations are definitely changing fairly significantly, which will introduce risk and variability within our models. Although some of these subsets of new populations may be great lending opportunities to customers that could really use them right now. So now I'm going to hand it over to Greg, who is going to discuss what are we hearing from some of the public companies in this space about what they are experiencing with respect to the pandemic.
Thanks, Steve. Sorry, I had to unmute myself. As Steve mentioned, these are some of the results from public companies in the space. We'll start with the lending space, and there's a whole group of them. A lot of them are near and subprime that we have here, but there's also a tier of peer-to-peer lenders. So you have the results from Regional Management World Acceptance, both reported Q1 results in the beginning of this month. All the lenders reported roughly the same pattern, that the downturn started in mid-March, with the last 2 weeks of March being tough, but the first part of April being worse than March. The results generally bottomed in April and then started stabilizing from there. Both of these lenders cited cautious, optimistic results coming out of May. And that's consistent with what we see in the data from our customers as well, that it seems to be getting better over the last couple of weeks. In the branch environment, you can see that regional was down 62% in April. And that's pretty consistent what we've seen as well, that that number is pretty close to what we're seeing kind of across the board. Returning customers or refis were generally in the same kind of 50 to 60% down range. And the difference really, and this is consistent with what both these lenders are saying, as well as what the OLA just put out a document, the Online Lenders Association just put out a document that shows about an 80% drop down for new customers. And this is really, it's a couple of things. These are mainly new customers that people are going after. It's lead generation on the digital side. A lot of companies stop their programs, pause them, stop sending out new inquiries, as Jimmy had mentioned with the credit card portfolio earlier. And that was driven by the companies themselves, that they tightened their credit policies, they decided to take a pause, and the pause was really in the face of uncertainty, and that was pretty common across the board for everybody. The interesting piece is the quality side of things. Jimmy, can you go back? On the quality front, you see regionals numbers here at the bottom. And the numbers weren't that bad. So they were at 6.6% at the end of the quarter. That actually dropped to 5.4% in April. Deferral programs increased by about 3%. So you could say maybe it went from 5.4 to 8.4 because the deferrals essentially created, removed a 30-day delinquency. World ended the quarter with about 8.3% in what they call bad debt. They don't actually have delinquencies that they report. And that includes modifications as well. So probably in the same range. OneMain had 38-day delinquencies at 2.3%. And that's one of the things that we want to call out is that financial obligations as a percent of disposable personal income is hovering at around 15%, and you have to go back to 1980 to get that number. So the consumers are coming into this pandemic better off than they have been in a long, long time. On the peer-to-peer side, it was interesting. I was on a call and the impairments went from 5% to 15.5%, and loan modifications were 11.5% of that. So the peer-to-peer side might be a little bit worse than even some of these, which is really interesting. The regional management team did an analysis on the stimulus package, and they calculated that the stimulus package for unemployment alone plus some of the federal checks annualizes out to 35%, $35,000 a year. And this is important to regional because their CEO stated that a meaningful portion of their customers earn less than $35,000 a year. So there may be a dynamic where the low end of the market is actually more stable because of the stimulus versus the middle tier of the market, which the peer-to-peer guys might be seeing. Now switching to what drives the economy, Jimmy. I wanted to share some payment data. So we've got Fiserv here, who has the majority of the merchant processing and debit card volume through their First Data acquisition. You've got Visa here. There's also MasterCard. Between Visa and MasterCard, they're most of the payments. And again, the backdrop here is the consumers coming in to this very, very healthy. We saw the savings rates in the United States in March jump to 13% because income went down by 2% and spending went down by 7%. And again, you got to go back to 1980 to see that kind of savings rate in the US. So you'll see, again, same pattern. March was down 30% as things fell off very quickly. And then it improved to about 12% for April and May. And that's kind of what we see the economists saying, that they think this is going to be an 8 to 10% hit to the economy. Visa's numbers are right here. On the left-hand side, you'll see credit and debit. It's interesting that debit recovered a lot faster. But again, that might be the lower end of the market where there are less credit cards, there are more debit cards. You see card present and not present on the right-hand side. So card present is in person, not present is generally a way to look at online. And then the last one, which is the most interesting, is card present X travel. And so generally speaking, the card not present has been doing very well. And the card not present X travel was never down and is up 30% from here. So again, the thing that drives the economy is spending. The consumer was in good shape going into this. They still seem to be in good shape from this kind of spending pattern. And so we're optimistic that's something that we'll start seeing here in the next couple of months. We can move on now to our second polling question. So which of these is your top concern right now? We'll give you a couple of choices here to pick from. Couple more seconds. Okay, let's see the results. So lead quality, which is, uncertainty about where all this is going, seems to fit everything. Default rates and deferral requests, which is something that everybody's struggling with, that everybody's working through. But again, on the public side, the lesson there is that the companies that actually got out there very quickly are still doing well on loan delinquencies. So now I'm going to hand it back over to Jimmy, and we'll keep going.
Awesome. Thanks, Greg. So as we look at what can be done and what can we do to help in this process, we really see that there's three key steps. And the first of these is the use of relevant, timely data, which is just effectively real-time data that's just more effective. So we have found that our use of a retail payment database has been extremely predictive, especially in the COVID environment, for the ability to help predict credit, screen, things like that. And put simply, if you look at the traditional data models, traditional FICO models, they're just not going to give indications of whether a consumer is still spending, what their spending habits are. They're a great rear view mirror for a lot of things, but in a lot of cases, what we're seeing is they're an artifact. So the use of this real-time retail data source, especially when you consider the limited number of locations that somebody has to actually shop at and buy at today, is just extremely relevant. And ultimately, if those behaviors are changing in real time, the ability to make that part of the information queue going back has been really helpful for people like Steve to be able to incorporate into our models. And here's a little bit of just kind of gee whiz numbers and stats as far as some of what we see and what we utilize as part of our process. What we found is just that in the moment, this data is just a heck of a lot more helpful and really reflects the commerce volume that's happening in the market today. And as you think about it, just one of the data points on here, check writer data, think about that on the front end of things. So it's not just the spend on the front end, but did a transaction go bad? Was there a return from it? And then if there was a return from it, are people paying for those debts or not? So lots of interesting inputs from that. Second step, which you see on the screen here, is the use of custom credit scores. So this is a key part of our philosophy here at Accelitas. The use of the custom scores just really allows us to tailor to our clients, and Steve's going to talk about that a little bit.
Thanks, Jimmy. So here I'll provide a general overview of the techniques we leverage in our modeling process and how it's applicable during the pandemic. So one of the main things we do is we take a multidisciplinary approach that leverages techniques from computer vision, deep learning, natural language processing, classical statistics, and signal processing. And having a team with experience from a wide range of disciplines allows us to use the tools and techniques that best fit the particular problem under the given constraints. So what this figure is showing is a rank order plot and how the scores changed after applying some of the modeling techniques we leverage. So the score is bucketed into deciles on the x-axis, and the higher the score, the better the applicant is predicted to be. The bars represent the performance of the customers that fall into the buckets. And ideally, a model will provide as large a separation as possible between the risky customers and the low-risk applicants. One critical thing that we look at when improving these models is to still work within the constraint of having them be interpretable or explainable. So we've developed methods that allow our models to infer nonlinear relationships within the data, while also providing the ability to explain why, from a feature standpoint, a score may have been low. So this provides our customers with the benefits of a highly predictive model that is also FCRA compliant. Another simple and yet powerful way of improving accuracy is to customize the model specifically to different attributes. So the alternative to this would be to throw all the data in one large single model. These segmentation attributes can be based off geography, channel, segment, product. Additionally, these could be long or short-term performance metrics or stages in a waterfall. So modeling particular clusters of applicants allows the models to focus specifically on subpopulations and decrease the importance of the rest, while we can still leverage the leverage remaining data elements too. So the different clusters are, the larger the opportunity for improvement could be. So this has become critical in this pandemic as volume moves from one population to another, as I showed you earlier with the years since last seen measurement. And to support this kind of modeling, our models, but also our underlying infrastructure, have to be very flexible to ingest general attributes and then take custom action based on those attributes. The customization techniques I described, along with continuous feedback over time, allow us to incrementally improve upon model performance. And this figure shows one example of how we measure performance using an ROC plot. This is useful in a classification scenario where the objective is to predict one of two classes. So for example, this could be profit versus loss for a loan. And ideally, a decision from a score would maximize the true positives, which are the correctly accepted profitable customers, and minimize the false positives, which are incorrectly accepted lossy customers in that example. So the goal for this measurement is to get the curve as close as possible to the upper left. And AUC, which means represents the area under the curve, is a way to represent this line as one single number, where the curve all the way to the upper left would have an AUC of 1. So the color lines here provide evidence of incremental improvement over time for the same population, but improving upon the score with both continuous feedback and customization. So you'll see these improvements are incremental, while others are more significant. And during times of uncertainty, particularly with changing customer populations, this process of constant monitoring and associated improvement are critical to maintain performance of the score.
Hey, Steve. So a little bit earlier, I mentioned and talked about kind of our culture as an organization of working closely with clients and learning about their business. And so you're sort of talking about that right now as far as, changing environments and what have you. So I know that part of my sales team's job is to harass you and work on behalf and advocate on behalf of our clients. But can you talk a little bit about that feedback loop of how our client success and salespeople would work with a client and then get that relevant information to you, especially in a COVID environment that would be helpful for kind of a rebuild or recustomization process?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, Jimmy, your sales team and then my data science team will work with the customers on a regular basis. So with custom scores, the way to get the most out of the models is to understand as much as possible what the client is intending to do with that score. So changes in the target variable may vary if you want to predict default versus conversion, or maybe a joint modeling of predicting conversion and default together, where you want to identify customers less likely to default but highly likely to convert. So additionally, knowing what data are leveraged within the waterfall, what customer and sometimes lead information, like it was mentioned on the query, knowing that lead information and all the other customer information are significant factors in how a custom score can work. And that's what we use to tailor it to the customers.
Perfect. Totally got you to finish my slide for me. That's fantastic. So this is really the third pillar, the third key is that custom tailoring and that discussion back and forth. And I think that one of the things that I enjoy the best about working here is that close connectivity of there's not a lot of interference between getting the feedback from the client and then actually working directly to turn that into something that we can make hay with in the form of a model or a new model or a new application or use case. So that's really cool. So these are the 3 steps that we talked about and the 3 keys that we bring to bear. So the first is the use of the right data. And as we talked about, that retail data, that essential real-time data is just incredibly useful in this environment. Put simply, versus conventional, traditional models rather, it just has an ability to deliver feedback that you can't otherwise get, and really can act as a proxy for confirming things like employment, continued spend, health, things like that. financial health, right? Second is really the custom score type model, which is geared towards specific goals. And then the third is tying in those custom scores to a very, very fast feedback loop cycle of, are they performing? What has changed? What's changed within the client's business? And then certainly, are there additional goals? We found this to be successful. We enjoy doing this for our clients. We're happy to talk about this more. So I know we've been accumulating quite a few questions here. So let me click and see where we're at and see how many we can take. If we don't get to your question today, by all means, we'll circle back. First is, can I use these models to rescore my existing customers? So the short answer is yes. Steve, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so we can basically do a check on your existing customers to see how they would have changed since, you know, when you first onboarded them. And that's a great indicator of health of that customer. So we can give you health over any period of time, whether it's 1 month, 2 months, or 3 months into a longer term loan. And then you know, that allow our clients to take whatever actions are necessary to keep that loan going well.
Gotcha. Okay, I'll take the second one, which is, should they be used to complement or replace my existing scores? And the answer is, it could be both. There are scenarios where it absolutely makes sense to marry it and work in concert with an existing score process. There are plenty of situations where it's a champion challenger, where we're replacing another score, or just replacing in a place in the waterfall process. So it really depends on the use case. I think that when you look at a very tactical environment like the COVID environment, certainly it may make sense to make a decision based on a specific need in right now, and that's very, very helpful. So great question. The next question, which as a salesperson I love to see, is how quickly can I get in this market? Can I get this in market? First of all, whoever that was, call me right away. But by all means, from the standpoint of our ability to work with you, typically what we like to do is just understand what you're trying to achieve, make sure that what you're doing and the use case and the data is something that we can readily work with. Traditionally, we'll work with Steve and the data science team to develop a score, and actually train a process towards that. And then from there, as we train towards that, be able to work with you towards that result. So from a timeline perspective, for, you know, on a baseline example, you're probably talking about a handful of weeks, but it really depends upon the service that you're talking about. There are some that are a heck of a lot faster to get up and running. So again, happy to have that discussion, and by all means, please feel free to reach out. Next question is Accelitas going to do another webinar? So this is our first webinar, at least since in the year that I've been here, and something we're going to be actively considering for sure. So by all means, if you have suggestions on additional topics, if you have feedback on this one, please give us that, and we'd love to do that. How could I use your service to identify the new borrowers that you highlighted? So Steve, maybe that's kind of geared towards your slides, so I'll let you answer that.
Yeah, so we have data. We've identified attributes, like I've shown you earlier, from different data vendors that highlight what these new populations look like, and then we have historical measurements on how they've performed. So we can build models, and we are building models that will predict that for you. So, you know, just we can score applicants at this time that'll say, yes, these are new customers that fit in this population that are going to be low risk for if you accept them for a loan.
Gotcha. Thank you.
The chat window is so small.
Yeah, it really is.
There's a good one about which lending platforms are you guys integrated into? So there are some that we are specifically integrated into, but the majority of our customers actually come to us directly through the APIs. All of our services are API based, and they're simple REST calls to the APIs. So we see a lot of custom platforms that people have built themselves in the markets that we're in. but we can follow up afterwards if you want to reach out to us. We'll give you and tell us which platform you're on. We'd be happy to tell you if we're integrated into them.
Gotcha. And there's one person who's here said that they've actually heard different information as far as the leads coming in on the online lending space. So again, that's interesting, and kind of an interesting good data point is that maybe there's lenders out there seeing different things. I can tell you that certainly from talking to many online lenders that at least initially that was the feedback that they got, was that there was feedback that they gave us was that there was tremendous amount of leads coming in, so many that they actually had to reconsider their lead buying processes because it was just perhaps wasteful. And we were involved in some of the efforts there to potentially help them with some of that. So if you heard something different, I'd love to talk to you offline and see if we can compare.
But that could also be the timing of the stimulus checks, because remember, unemployment took 2 or 3 weeks to get in place and get into people's hands, and then the federal checks came in and the $1,200 came in. And so I think a lot of that feedback we heard was really early on, and then the question is, did that change over time with the extra federal money there?
Yep, no, that makes sense. Okay, well, our goal was really to get everybody off the call by 10:45 so you can get ready for your next Zoom call, as we're all living in Zoom land today. So again, if there's additional questions that you have, we're more than happy to answer them. We've enjoyed chatting with you today and hope this information is helpful for you. And as I said a little bit earlier, that we love working with our clients, love working with love learning about their businesses and finding ways that we can work together. If we're working with you today, we appreciate your business and look forward to continuing our relationship. If we're not talking with you yet, not working with you yet, we'd love that opportunity. Feel free to reach out. I know we're going to send out some follow-up information out of this in the way of, I think, an e-guide and also a recording. So by all means, look for that. But thank you very much for your attention today, and we appreciate the participation.
Thanks, everyone.